Joining us now to talk about a new piece that he wrote about potential intergenerational conflict with the direction of policies that we are pursuing here in the U.S. is Philip Pilkington. He is an economist. He's also written a book critical of neoclassical economics called The Reformation in Economics. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, our pleasure. Piece was very interesting and provocative, just laying out how the fact that we don't have population growth certainly sufficient for replacement at this point could lead to intergenerational conflict. Just laying out the case that you're making here.
Yeah, so it's I'm kind of making the case off a book that was released recently and has got a lot of attention in economic policy circles and also in finance. I've worked in finance for about 10 years, so I know kind of both scenes. It's a book by Charles Goodhart and another economist called Protan, and they're making it. They're kind of laying out. We've known for a long time that that birth rates were becoming problematic, probably for about 20 years, and there have long been debates about it. I know in America it's long been debated about Social Security and whether it can maintain its solvency. But this book kind of was talking about more of the kind of real forces that most people would face, and I thought it was the first time that economists had actually tried to think through what it would be like to live in a world that has serious problems with population growth. And although the book is very good, and I much recommend it, it is a technical macroeconomics book, and it focused really on the technicals. And I thought that there was a case to be made to try and write an essay about that, kind of imagining what that would look like through a political economy lens. Yeah. And I think when you think about it, what we're probably facing down, and I mean it's our generation, it's Gen Xers and Millennials will be the first, I think, to really experience this as we age, is that there won't be enough people effectively to man the machines as people get older, and this means that there'll be reasonably large resource constraints on economies, and we'll have to share it between the people who work, the younger people, and the older people, and that extends from both consumption goods, but also to ownership of things, especially property, but also stocks and bonds and so on. And I just in the piece I kind of try to imagine what that would entail, and the conclusion I come to is it has to generate pretty severe intergenerational conflict.
Yeah, I'm reading here, quote, imagine in 50 years we've reached the point where the rapidly aging population of the wealthy West is distorting economic life. If the young decide they want to solve this problem, what are their options? Put brutally, the only way the young could gain more control over resources and assets is through forcible confiscation or worse, termination of the elderly. In some of the societies where we see this already in the year 2022 at the most extreme, like in Japan and more, are we seeing some of these predictions kind of come to light, Philip?
No, Japan is a funny one because it's the first country to experience the aging. It experienced it earlier than other countries, and it's actually had the opposite impact. And so this has been the debate against the book that I'm talking about. That people say, well, look, so the book predicts, for example, inflation, asset market inflation, just very uncomfortable economic dynamics. Japan has seen the opposite of that. Now, it hasn't been positive. Japan is known, turning Japanese in finance and economic speak tends to mean stagnation. So Japan has been experiencing the growth stagnation that we'd expect because there just aren't enough people to man the machines and buy things. So the growth stagnation is there. Japan hasn't really grown that much for about 20 years, but we haven't seen the inflation. That is very specific to the Japanese economic system. It's because effectively young people are willing to accept wages that don't grow in Japan. Now, why that is, technically speaking, it's because they're paid on bonus systems. Anyone who receives a salary in Japan is effectively paid like a financier here in the West, which is a good portion, maybe 40% of their pay comes as a bonus at the end of the year. That means that when times aren't good and when the growth slows, they don't get an increase in wages. So from a technical point of view, we do not have that wage flexibility in our economies. Do we want it? Probably not. But also, I just don't think Westerners would accept that. I think that there's more, there's a kind of culture of respect for elders in Japan that I don't think we have in the West. And so I don't think we'll get away with overt wage suppression. So short answer, they are experiencing problems, but they're slightly different problems from what we're experiencing. Well, what we will experience probably.
You had a part in here that I thought was really interesting that I hadn't thought of before. You say the capitalist system discourages family formation and fertility. Can you just lay out the sort of rationale behind that, or why you argue that?
Yeah, I mean, the capitalism is a great system for making and distributing stuff. It will make and distribute stuff as much as it possibly can, because a profit motive is there for you to make and distribute that stuff, and you can make money out of it. Capitalism doesn't innately care about the human capital that it is formed on top of. So for the capitalist system, the ideal human, in a sense, is a worker consumer, somebody who goes to work as much as possible, produces as many things as possible, and then goes to the shop and buys those things as much as possible. That person, increasingly, it looks like, probably is a single individual rather than a family unit. There's many different reasons for that. You can use your own imagination, but just the fact that you have to work so much, or that your entire personal life, in a sense, becomes so revolving around consumption, earning and spending, it seems to discourage the formation of families. The problem is that capitalism relies on that human capital. It relies on a growing labor force. It needs it to sustain itself. But of course, capitalism isn't conscious of itself. It's just people making decisions about trying to make profit, or trying to work more, or trying to consume more, or whatever. So it's not. Capitalism can't think about the threats that it poses to itself. It almost, I joke sometimes that this is kind of what Karl Marx should have been looking at. He always thought that there were contradictions in capitalism. And he thought, for example, rates of profit would fall, and overproduction would do this and that. And some of the things he said were true, and most of them weren't. But this is a real contradiction of capitalism. If the end point or telos of capitalism is to have everybody turned into a hyper worker, hyper consumer who doesn't spend time raising a family, then capitalism will eat itself.
Right. And here's the question, though. Is there anything that can be done about it? Because, I look, a lot of people here on the right, they like to talk about Hungary. I mean, yeah, they increased their birth rate from like 1.2 to 1.7. I'm not saying that's bad, but they threw the kitchen sink at it in terms of their economy. And it's a very different country too, in terms of their demographics, what they're willing to accept, social spending, and more. Is it possible in the West in order to reverse this trend at all, Philip? Or am I just being too cynical?
You are right that Hungary is the only place that has managed to, through policy, increase its birth rate. It was from a low base. The communism destroyed family formation a lot quicker than capitalism did. They both seem to, but communism had a concerted effort. The post-communist countries tended to have very low birth rates. So Hungary was starting from a low base, but they increased it 30%. And that is not to be sniffed at. And I also would highlight that while the birth rate increased 30%, the marriage rate increased even more. And I think that encouraging people to get married is probably the first step here. I mean, if you look at statistics now, for people born in the 1980s and 1990s, it looks like, best case scenario, only 50 to 60% of those people are going to get married even once. So even married and divorced, only 50 to 60%. That's down on 80 to 90% for the previous two generations, for the baby boomers and the World War II generation. So is there anything to do about it? I mean, you're right. Hungary has thrown the kitchen sink at it. They've been very aggressive. They spent a lot on it. But they have seen some success, so that does give hope. Now, one thing I would counsel is there are more left-wing attempts that have been attempted at this for a very long time. So it's not widely known, but Sweden, since the 1960s, has been running pronatal policies. The foundation of Swedish social democracy was an economist called Gunnar Myrdal and his wife were promoting natal policies beginning in the early 60s. And these were things like childcare, state childcare, more socialist solutions to the problem. They have not worked. Sweden has had lower birth rates than the US for most of the time, and currently sits at the same birth rate. So if there is a solution, it really seems more to be the Hungarian solution rather than the Swedish solution. Will either of them work? I don't know.
And Philip, the other thing that you dismiss in the piece, which is an obvious solution if you need more people to have a vibrant society and not have this intergenerational conflict, is increased levels of immigration. And you say that turns out to be politically destabilizing. But does that always have to be the case? I mean, certainly in America, we've had a lot of waves of immigrants, and that's led to tension at times, but ultimately people are absorbed, and the country has been, sort of strengthened and made very vital by the different waves of immigration that we have. And even now, when we've had a lot of very fraught conversations about immigration here, I just looked up the data. Data for Progress poll recently found 69% of people support a pathway to citizenship. So is it in fact inevitable that immigration is going to lead to political instability and is not a potential pathway forward to solving the issue that you identify here?
Well, one thing is that immigration will not solve the problem alone. The problem is that when the immigrants come to the highly developed Western wealthy societies, they, as you say, they integrate to a large extent into those societies and their birth rates fall. So the immigration has staved off population growth decline. Population in the United States, for example, is still growing, mainly due to immigration, but it has not solved the problem of an aging population. Even though population is still growing in the US, the population continues to age. And that's because when immigrants come in from Central America and Southern America, they adapt to the new surroundings and they lower their birth rate. So number one, I would say it does not actually, it does help in terms of perpetuating economic growth. And it definitely helps in terms of population growth, but it does not help in terms of the aging structure, which is kind of the core thing that I'm getting at in the essay. In terms of political tension, I mean, I'm sure we all have I'm trying to be as objective as possible about this. The tensions that immigration has brought in Europe have been profound. Absolutely not. There is no politics in Europe that isn't immigration focused. All the headlines from Eric Zemmour in France, now competing with Le Pen because there's so much demand for this kind of rhetoric, to Sweden, I mentioned, that have been pro-natalist since the 1960s. The entire Conservative Party in Sweden has been demolished, and the Sweden Democrats now are in charge. This trend is absolutely everywhere in Europe. Brexit in the UK, where I am, was clearly driven partly by anti-immigrant sentiment. And I think in the US, probably the somewhat divisive presidency of Donald Trump was in part due to this immigration policy. The one thing I also...
But I will say that, I don't think that those things, I'm going to speak to the American context because it's what I know the most about and put Europe to the side for the moment. But again, even with Donald Trump, I think you're right, tapping into this anti-immigrant sentiment, making, immigrants the scapegoats of what ultimately has been a failed policy of neoliberalism that has created this mass inequality and made an underclass that is so desperate. Even with that factor, you still have the overwhelming majority of people supporting a pathway to citizenship, believing that immigrants contribute more good than harm in society. So even at a time when people have been incredibly stressed by, the financial catastrophe and the fallout from that and these roiling politics, you still have a mass majority sentiment in favor of the benefits of immigration within the American context.
That could be the case, but the sizable minority that doesn't like it get very angry. And I think that's the cause of a lot of political division and a lot of political tension. The other problem that I see in the American polls is that recent immigrants don't seem to be very favorable to more immigrants. And so it seems that the more immigrants you bring in, the less support you'll have for immigration. It seems paradoxical, but it seems to be the case. I mean, my baseline assumption is just there are natural limits on how much immigration you can have. You can have quite a bit of immigration. I'm not particularly anti-immigration personally, but there do seem to be political and social limits to it. And there are also problems with job allocation and funding welfare payments and so on. So I'm just highlighting the fact that, number one, it doesn't solve the aging problem because the immigrants adapt. And number two, I think there is reason to believe that even if majorities still support it in America, I think that's changing in Europe, and it may change in America. I think the minority that doesn't support it is getting increasingly agitated, and I don't think that's good for political stability.
I think that's very well said.
There's always going to be a lot of political conflict around anything we do, whether it's family formation policies or levels of immigration. I think that is sort of inevitable. But if you have policies that make sure that people, are basically okay and feel secure in their own lives, then they're going to be less susceptible to the type of scapegoating politics that we have seen. But I think the piece is really interesting. I think people should read it. It's very provocative, and I really appreciate you coming on and taking the time to explain it.
Thanks, Philip.
Thanks very much.
Our pleasure.
Thank you guys so much for watching. Really appreciate it. It was a fun show today. I really enjoyed it. Just look, we are in current discussions about how much we can build the show, all of that. I know I say it, but things are coming. It's going to be big. We obviously have it's 2022. We have the midterms coming up, so we're looking at expanding. We appreciate your support. There's a link down there in the description, and we can't appreciate you guys enough.
Thank you guys. We love you. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.